In March 1861, 6 weeks before the first shots of the American Civil War were fired, the Vice President of the Confederate States of America stood before a crowd in Savannah, Georgia, and gave a speech. His name was Alexander Stephens. He was not a man who minced words. He was not a man who hid behind polite euphemism or strategic ambiguity. He was a politician who believed that clarity was a virtue. And on the evening of March 21, 1861, he deployed that clarity with extraordinary precision. He told the crowd exactly what the Confederacy was for. He said, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea from the Declaration of Independence. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." He also said, this was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. The rupture he was describing was secession. The revolution was the Civil War that was about to begin. He was telling his audience clearly, proudly, without ambiguity, that the Confederacy existed to preserve slavery, that slavery was its cornerstone, and that the war being fought was being fought to protect that institution. Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, said in public in 1861 that the Civil War was about slavery. This is worth remembering, because 20 years later, the same Alexander Stephens would claim he had been misquoted, and 50 years after that, American schoolchildren in 11 states would be learning from textbooks approved by Confederate veterans organizations that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. And 111 years after that, the state of Georgia would finish carving 3 Confederate leaders into the face of a mountain as a monument to honor and heritage, not as a monument to the institution that Stephens had described, in his own words, as the Confederacy's cornerstone. This is the story of how a defeated nation rewrote its own history, not in secret, not through censorship or the destruction of documents, in public, through monuments and textbooks and veterans organizations and Hollywood films, through the patient, systematic, decades-long construction of a myth so successful that it did not merely rewrite the history of one war. It reshaped the racial politics of an entire country for a century and a half. The Confederacy lost the Civil War on the battlefield. It won the war over memory, at least for a while. Let us begin with the facts. Stated plainly, because the lost cause myth depends on its audience not knowing them or knowing them, and having been given enough alternative framing to feel uncertain. The American Civil War began in April 1861. It ended in April 1865. Approximately 750,000 soldiers died, the highest death toll of any American war, before or since, representing roughly 5% of the entire American population. The South lost. Slavery was abolished. That is the basic factual summary. Now let us answer the question that the lost cause myth has been obscuring for 160 years. What was the war about? Here is a useful exercise. When someone tells you the Civil War was about states' rights rather than slavery, ask them which states' rights. Specifically, the Confederacy was fighting to preserve. The secession documents answer this question. They were written by the people who made the decision to secede. They explain, in the specific legal and political language of 1861, exactly what motivated the decision. South Carolina, the first state to secede, published a declaration of the causes of secession in December 1860 alone. The word slavery or slave appears in various forms, more than 18 times. The document describes at length the grievance that northern states were not returning escaped enslaved people as required by the Fugitive Slave Act. It explicitly frames secession as a response to the perceived threat to the institution of slavery. Mississippi's declaration, issued in January 1861, opens with a sentence that leaves no interpretive room. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia's declaration identifies the threat to slavery as the primary cause of secession. Texas's declaration describes the state as having been established for white supremacy and the subordination of black people as core to its identity. These are not the documents of states defending abstract constitutional principles. They are the documents of states defending a specific institution and the economic and social order built on it. And then there is Vice President Stevens's Cornerstone speech, which we heard at the opening of this episode, delivered extemporaneously, which means without a prepared text, which means it reflected what Stevens actually believed, rather than what a committee had drafted to a large, enthusiastic audience in his home state. Stevens told that audience, directly and without qualification, that the Confederacy was founded on slavery and white supremacy. He said it was the immediate cause of secession. He said it was the cornerstone of the new government. He said it, in public, to people who cheered. So that is what the war was about. Not as a matter of contested interpretation, as a matter of documented record, written by the people who made the decision to go to war. Before the war began, when they had no reason to soften or obscure their motivations, the states' rights argument was not a competing interpretation. It was a later invention. It was what the same people said after they lost when slavery had been abolished and defending it openly was no longer a viable political position. The transition from "we are fighting to preserve slavery" to "we were fighting for states' rights" took approximately one generation. The mechanisms by which it was accomplished are the subject of this episode. But first, a brief moment to appreciate the audacity of the project. Consider what the Lost Cause set out to do. Take a war that the losers had started, for a reason they had stated openly and proudly. Take their comprehensive military defeat. Take the abolition of the institution they had fought to preserve. Take the death of 300,000 of their soldiers. Take the economic devastation of their region. Take the democratic and civil rights revolution represented by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the abolition of slavery, the guarantee of equal citizenship, the right to vote for black men, and then reframe all of it. Transform the losers into noble heroes. Transform the cause they fought for the perpetuation of chattel slavery into a dignified constitutional principle. Transform the men who commanded armies in service of that cause into saints and demigods. Transform the people who had been enslaved from the human beings whose liberation was the war's most significant outcome into background figures, or into participants in a social arrangement that the lost cause described as benign. And do all of this not in secret but in public, systematically, over several decades, through the control of textbooks, monuments, legal systems, and popular culture. That is the project. It is considered purely as an exercise in historical revision. Arguably, the most successful misinformation campaign in American history. Let us watch how it was built. April no. Isimbaba Loshu. Robert E. Lee rode to Appomattox in his finest uniform because, he said, he would rather die than be taken prisoner. The implication being that if he was going to be captured, at least he would be dressed well for it. Grant met him in a muddy private's coat because Grant had been in the field and had not had time to change. And Grant was also the kind of man who did not think especially hard about what he was wearing when he had just won a war. Lee surrendered. The terms were generous. Grant allowed Confederate soldiers to keep their horses because they would need them for farming, and he forbade Union soldiers from celebrating the defeat of their fellow Americans. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Approximately 300,000 Confederate soldiers had died. The white South had lost, by some estimates, in nearly 18% of its military-age male population, a proportion of loss that is difficult to comprehend in contemporary terms. Families were destroyed. Communities were depleted. The physical infrastructure of the region, railroads, bridges, ports, in some cases entire cities, had been devastated by 4 years of combat fought mostly on Confederate soil. And the social and economic order that the entire region had been built around 4 million enslaved people, their labor underpinning everything from the plantation economy to the social status of white Southerners who owned no enslaved people themselves but who lived in a society structured around the racial hierarchy that slavery enforced, was gone. Legally gone. Anyway, here is where we need to understand the psychology of the lost cause, because it cannot be understood purely as cynical propaganda. It was also, in its origins, in the minds of the people who built it, a genuine response to genuine psychological trauma. The white South had lost, catastrophically. It had sent its sons to die for a cause, and 300,000 of them had died. And the cause had failed anyway. The institution of slavery had been destroyed. The social order of the antebellum South, the world those soldiers had lived in and fought to preserve, was gone. To acknowledge, fully and without qualification, what the war had been about, that the sons had died to preserve slavery, that the cause had been the perpetuation of a system that denied the humanity of 4 million people, that the Confederacy had been founded on the explicit premise of white supremacy was psychologically unsustainable for a population that had just experienced that level of loss. So they built a different story. Not all of them. Not simultaneously. And the story was not purely a coping mechanism, it was also, very deliberately, a political tool. But it began, as these things often do, in the overlap between genuine grief and strategic necessity. The man most responsible for systematizing the lost cause narrative was not, at first glance, an obvious propagandist. He was a general, a good one, a man of enormous energy and considerable grievances. His name was Jubal Early. Jubal Early had been by 1865, one of the more capable Confederate generals, not the most famous, not the most beloved, but effective and aggressive, and genuinely talented at mobile warfare. He had also been, by the end of the war, decisively defeated by Union General Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. His army effectively destroyed in 3 pitched battles in the autumn of 1864. After the war, Early fled to Mexico and then Canada. Unwilling to take the oath of loyalty to the United States that Reconstruction required, he returned in 1869 bitter, defeated, and possessed of an almost pathological need to explain why the Confederacy's defeat was not the Confederacy's fault. He was, in this respect, the Ludendorff of the American Civil War, except that where Ludendorff needed the defeat to be someone else's fault, because he had been the one running the war, Early needed the defeat to be explicable in terms that did not require acknowledging what the war had been about. In 1869, Early joined a group of Confederate officers in founding the Southern Historical Society. The society's explicit purpose was to shape the historical record of the Civil War, to produce, publish, and distribute accounts of the war from a Confederate perspective. before Union veterans and Northern historians could establish the dominant narrative. This was not a subtle project. The people involved knew exactly what they were doing. They were, in their own words, fighting a war over history because they had lost the war on the ground. The Southern Historical Society papers published beginning in 1876 became the flagship journal of Lost Cause historiography. Every issue defended some aspect of the Confederate war effort, glorified Confederate leaders, or attacked the historiography of Union veterans who told a different story. Early became its most prolific and most influential contributor. Early strategy was, in retrospect, elegant in its cynicism. He understood, or perhaps intuited, that naked propaganda is easily dismissed. What you need is the apparatus of scholarship. You need footnotes and journals and archives and learned societies. You need the lost cause to look. From a distance, like history. The Southern Historical Society papers looked like history. They had the right format. They cited documents. They named sources. They engaged with the evidentiary record of the war selectively, strategically, consistently in the direction of Confederate apologetics, but engaging with it nonetheless. This gave the lost cause something that emotional grievance alone could never provide: the appearance of credibility. The lost cause, as it crystallized in the 1870s and 1880s, rested on 6 central claims. 1. The Civil War was not primarily about slavery. It was about states' rights, specifically the constitutional right of states to govern themselves without federal interference. 2. The South had not started the war aggressively. The North had been the aggressor, forcing the South into a defensive posture. 3. The Confederate soldier was morally and militarily superior. He fought with greater valor, greater skill, and greater honor than his Union counterpart. The Confederacy lost only because of the Union's overwhelming numerical and material advantage. 4. Robert E. Lee was a military genius of the first order. Perhaps the greatest general America has ever produced, a Christian gentleman of impeccable honor, who fought reluctantly, but brilliantly. 5. The antebellum South had been a civilized, ordered, gracious society. The mythical plantation culture of magnolias and chivalry and harmonious racial relationships that the war had destroyed. 6. Slavery, to the extent it is acknowledged at all, had been a benign institution. Enslaved people had been cared for, had been members of an extended family structure, and had not suffered under it in the ways that abolitionist propaganda claimed. Every one of these claims is either false or so drastically simplified as to be functionally misleading. We will examine several of them in detail. But first, we need to understand how they were disseminated, because the intellectual architecture of the myth, however elegantly constructed, would have remained the property of Confederate veterans' journals if it had not found mechanisms to reach the broader American public. Early Southern Historical Society provided the content. 2 other institutions provided the distribution. The United Confederate Veterans, being formed in 1889, became the institutional home of the lost cause among the men who had fought for it. By 1904, the UCV claimed 565 active local camps, with at least one camp in 75% of all counties in the 11 former Confederate states. These were not small operations. They were civic institutions, organizations that hosted community events, maintained cemeteries, organized annual reunions, and passed formal resolutions about how the war should be remembered and taught. The UCV's resolutions included, explicitly, directives about school textbooks. The organization formally objected to any textbook that used the word rebellion to describe the Civil War, or that mentioned slavery as a cause of the war, or that described the Confederate cause in terms that the organization found unflattering. Publishers who wanted to sell textbooks in the South understood what was required. But the United Confederate veterans were aging men, an aging Mendy, the institution that proved more durable, that carried the lost cause forward from the generation that had fought the war into the generations that had not, was composed primarily of women. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, was arguably the most effective propaganda organization in American history. That is not a hyperbolic claim. It is a description of their impact on American public memory. Measured by outcomes, the UDC campaigned for Confederate monuments successfully on a massive scale. The majority of Confederate monuments across the American South were erected between 1895 and 1965, not in the immediate aftermath of the war, when they might be understood as expressions of genuine grief, but during the height of the Lost Cause movement, and again during the Civil Rights era, when they functioned less as memorials and more as political statements. The UDC reviewed and approved school textbooks. They sent letters to school boards and publishing houses identifying objectionable content that accurately described slavery as the cause of the war, or that described Confederate leaders in unflattering terms, and they applied sustained, organized pressure to change it. They sponsored essay contests for schoolchildren on Lost Cause themes. They created a children's organization, the Children of the Confederacy, to begin the indoctrination earlier. They funded libraries and archives that housed Lost Cause materials. They placed plaques in schools identifying them as UDC approved. In 1892, the History Committee of the United Confederate Veterans met in New Orleans to develop standards for school textbooks. The committee, chaired by former Confederate General E. Kirby Smith, declared that any textbook using the word rebellion to describe the Civil War was objectionable. Any textbook that mentioned slavery as a cause was objectionable. Their 1,894 report stated, in explicit terms that deserve to be quoted directly, that the true cause of the war between the states was the dignified withdrawal of the Southern states from the Union to avoid the continued breaches of domestic tranquility, guaranteed but not consummated by the Constitution. Dignified withdrawal, not secession to protect slavery, which is what the secession documents had said. Dignified withdrawal. The distance between Alexander Stevens's 1,861 Cornerstone speech, slavery is the immediate cause of the present revolution, and the UCV's 1,894 textbook standard, dignified withdrawal over constitutional principle, is 23 years and approximately 300,000 Confederate dead. That is how long it took to rewrite the cause of the war. 23 years. The textbook campaign worked. Not immediately everywhere. Not completely. Not without resistance from Union veterans who knew what the war had been about and said so loudly and at length. But over time, and in the states where the UDC had the most organizational power, it worked. By the early 20th century, children in former Confederate states were learning from school-approved textbooks that the Civil War had been fought over states' rights, not slavery. The Confederate soldiers had been brave and honorable men defending their homeland against Northern aggression. Robert E. Lee had been a Christian gentleman and military genius. The antebellum South had been a gracious, ordered society. Reconstruction had been a period of corrupt Northern exploitation of the defeated South. These were not fringe beliefs. These were the mainstream narrative in large portions of the United States, the standard version of the Civil War for decades. A myth, systematically installed in the educational infrastructure of a country, taught to children before they can evaluate it, becomes something more than a myth. It becomes the default, the background assumption against which everything else is filtered. and changing default assumptions is extraordinarily hard, which is why the lost cause lasted as long as it did, and why it still hasn't entirely gone away. Let us go through the lost cause's central claims one by one. Not to be pedantic about it, though. A certain degree of pedantry is warranted when the alternative is allowing comfortable lies to continue unchallenged. But, because each claim tells us something specific about how the myth was constructed and what psychological function it was designed to serve, we will move quickly. The evidence is not subtle. This is the foundational claim. Everything else rests on it. If the war was about states' rights, then it was about a constitutional principle rather than a moral atrocity. And the men who fought it can be honored without endorsing what they were fighting for. The problem is the documents the Confederate states wrote down while they were seceding. They were not shy about it. Mississippi opened its declaration with the sentence we have already noted, thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Georgia's declaration spends paragraphs explaining the threat to slavery posed by Abraham Lincoln's election. Texas's declaration states explicitly that the state was founded for the servitude of the African to the white race. These are not documents that require interpretation. They are documents that require only reading. The states' rights argument, as a description of Confederate motivation, has a specific and revealing problem. The Confederacy was not, in general, in favor of states' rights when those rights conflicted with slavery. The Confederate Constitution actually prevented individual Confederate states from abolishing slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act, which the Confederate states strongly supported, was a massive expansion of federal power that required northern states to participate in the slave economy whether they wanted to or not. The Confederacy was not fighting for the abstract principle that states could govern themselves. It was fighting for the specific right to maintain slavery. When states' rights served that goal, they were invoked. When they didn't, they were ignored. The states' rights argument is not a competing interpretation of the Civil War's causes. It is a description of one specific right, the right to hold human beings as property, with the uncomfortable noun replaced by an abstraction. The historian Alan T. Nolan, in his essential 1991 book Lee Considered, put it simply, the Confederate States were not fighting for the abstract right of self-government. They were fighting for the right to maintain slavery. These are not the same thing, and the conflation of them is the lost cause's primary intellectual sleight of hand. This claim requires a specific reading of the war's beginning, specifically the bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12. Fort Sumter was a United States military installation in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. It was garrisoned by Union soldiers. Confederate forces demanded that those soldiers evacuate a military base of the United States government, located in what had been, until recently, United States territory. When the soldiers declined, Confederate forces opened fire. The Lost Cause addressed this inconvenience in several ways. One approach was to argue that Lincoln had forced the Confederacy to fire by refusing to withdraw Union soldiers from Southern territory. Another was to argue that the Confederacy had a legal right to the territory because secession had been constitutional. The constitutional argument is contested. Lincoln's position was that secession was legally void and that Confederate states remained United States territory, but it requires you to accept that the Confederacy had successfully seceded before a single shot was fired. If you accept that, then Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter was legally the Confederacy attacking a foreign military installation. If you do not accept that, then it was the Confederacy attacking its own country's military installation. Neither reading makes the Confederacy the defensive party. But the Lost Cause did not primarily argue the point legally. It argued it emotionally. The narrative of Southern defensiveness was not a constitutional argument. It was an image, the Southern homeland being invaded by Northern armies, Southern women and children threatened by Sherman's march, Southern farms and cities burned by the aggressive North. These things happened, Sherman did march through Georgia. Cities were burned. Farms were destroyed. The physical experience of the war, for the civilian population of the Confederacy, was genuinely traumatic. What the defensive war narrative required its audience to forget was why those armies were there. They were there because the Confederacy had seceded and fired on Fort Sumter. The invasion was a response to the secession. The secession was for slavery. The chain of causation runs in one direction, and the lost cause required breaking it at a convenient point. This is the claim that required the most creative accounting. The Confederacy did face numerical and material disadvantage. The Union had a larger population, more industrial capacity, more railroad infrastructure, and crucially access to the labor of free black workers, and eventually the military service of nearly 180,000 black soldiers. These advantages were real, but the lost cause transformed a genuine military disadvantage into a complete explanation for defeat, an explanation that required no acknowledgement of Confederate strategic failures, logistical problems, or political dysfunction. Early's contribution to the lost cause was, in large part, this numbers game. He spent enormous energy documenting Union numerical superiority in specific battles, particularly battles in Virginia, where he had served to demonstrate that Confederate defeats were the result of being overwhelmed rather than outgeneraled or outfought. The argument had enough truth in it to be useful. The Union did have more men and more materiel. The Confederacy was fighting a war of attrition. It could not win. These are real military facts. What the argument obscured was that numbers alone do not determine the outcome of wars. If they did, the Confederacy never would have lasted 4 years against the Union's advantages. Confederate armies won many battles against numerically superior Union forces. The war was decided, not by numbers alone, but by strategy, leadership, supply, morale, and the fundamental contradiction of fighting to maintain a system that your workforce, the enslaved people whose labor sustained the Confederate economy, was actively working to undermine. The hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who fled to Union lines, who refused to work Confederate fortifications, who passed intelligence to Union forces, who organized slowdowns and sabotage on Confederate plantations. These were among the most effective military actors of the war, and the lost cause myth wrote them almost entirely out of the story, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging what the war was about. Robert E. Lee is the central saint of the lost cause, its most important construction, its most successful product, the figure whose mythology has proven most durable and most resistant to historical revision. He was also, undeniably, an exceptional military commander. This is not in dispute. His campaigns in Virginia, particularly the 7 Days battles, Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, demonstrated genuine operational brilliance. His ability to read terrain, to make aggressive decisions with inferior forces, and to inspire his men was real. But the Lee of the lost cause was not merely an excellent general. He was a demigod, a man without meaningful flaw, without culpable decision, without moral complexity, a Christian gentleman who had taken up arms reluctantly, for his home state of Virginia rather than for slavery, a man of such transcendent honor that he could be held up as a national hero, not just a Southern hero, in the decades after the war. The construction of Lee's mythology required several specific moves. First, the claim that Lee opposed slavery. This claim is based largely on a letter Lee wrote in 1856, in which he described slavery as a moral and political evil. The letter is frequently cited in lost cause literature as evidence of Lee's anti-slavery sentiments. The letter is also frequently truncated. In the same letter, Lee argued that emancipation should proceed at God's pace, not man's, and that the people suffering most from slavery were not the enslaved but white Southerners. Forced to live alongside an inferior race, Lee enslaved people throughout his adult life. He managed the Custis estate inherited through his wife in ways that contemporaries described as particularly harsh, including ordering the whipping of enslaved people who had escaped and been recaptured. His military service was in command of an army, fighting to preserve the institution he claimed to find morally objectionable. These facts are not hidden. They are documented in the historical record. The lost cause required not inventing new facts about Lee, but selectively reading the facts that existed. Second, the claim that Lee fought for Virginia rather than for slavery. This is the reluctant warrior narrative Lee as a man torn between his loyalty to the Union and his loyalty to his home state, who ultimately chose family over politics. Lee did resign his Union commission and take command of Virginia's forces rather than fight against his home state. This is true, but the framing of this choice as a moral or sentimental rather than political decision requires ignoring what Virginia's secession was for. Virginia seceded to join the Confederacy. The Confederacy existed to preserve slavery. Lee chose to fight for Virginia in full knowledge of what Virginia's secession meant. Fighting for Virginia and fighting for slavery were not mutually exclusive. They were the same thing. In Aprilo 1866. Third, the construction of Lee as a figure of national rather than merely Southern identity. This was the Lost Cause's most ambitious project, getting not just the South but the entire United States to accept Lee as a hero. And it largely succeeded. It succeeded because the North needed it too. The project of national reunification after the Civil War required that former enemies could be reconciled. Confederate soldiers could not be simultaneously honored as brave Americans and condemned as traitors fighting for slavery. The reconciliation narrative required softening one side of that contradiction, and the Lost Cause provided exactly the softening that national reunification needed. By the 1880s, Union and Confederate veterans were attending joint memorials. By the 1890s, Lee's birthday was being celebrated across the South as a public holiday. By the early 20th century, Lee had been incorporated into the American military tradition as one of its exemplary figures. The cost of the Lee mythology, the cost of the entire reconciliation narrative that the Lost Cause enabled was paid by Black Americans. While white veterans of both sides were reconciling over shared memories of battlefield valor, the legal and political structures of Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal citizenship, the 15th Amendment's guarantee of Black men's voting rights, the Freedmen's Bureau's efforts to build schools and economic independence for formerly enslaved people were being dismantled through terrorism, voter suppression, and the complicity of a Northern public that had decided that sectional reconciliation mattered more than racial justice. The Compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction by withdrawing federal troops from the South in exchange for Southern electoral votes, was the political mechanism. The Lost Cause provided the cultural framework that made it acceptable. If the Confederacy had been fighting for constitutional principle rather than slavery, then Reconstruction was not the protection of Black civil rights against white Southern terrorism. It was Northern overreach into Southern affairs. And if it was Northern overreach, withdrawing it was not abandoning Black Americans. It was restoring the proper constitutional order. The Lost Cause did not merely rewrite the Civil War. It provided the ideological infrastructure for Jim Crow. Every myth needs a villain. We have discussed the heroes Lee, Jackson, the noble Confederate soldier. Now we need to understand who the Lost Cause assigned as its internal villain, because the choice reveals with remarkable clarity the myth's political function. The villain was James Longstreet. James Longstreet committed, in the eyes of the Lost Cause, two unforgivable sins. The first was that he had disagreed with Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg. On the third day of the battle, Longstreet had strongly advised against Pickett's charge, the assault that would end in catastrophic failure. He had urged Lee to maneuver around the Union position rather than assault it frontally. Lee had overruled him. Lee had ordered the charge. The charge had failed. In the lost cause narrative, this became Longstreet's fault. The argument developed primarily by Jubal early in the Southern Historical Society papers was that Longstreet had been slow to execute the charge, that his reluctance had robbed it of the momentum it needed to succeed, that if he had attacked as ordered and with full commitment, Gettysburg would have been a Confederate victory and the war might have ended differently. This argument required ignoring substantial evidence, including the testimony of other Confederate officers present, that Longstreet had executed his orders reasonably, and that the charge was tactically unsound regardless of timing. It also required ignoring that Lee himself never blamed Longstreet for Gettysburg. Lee's own post-war statements described Gettysburg as his own responsibility and his own mistake. But Early needed Gettysburg to be someone else's fault. Because if Gettysburg was Lee's mistake, then Lee was not infallible. And the entire mythology of Lee's military genius required careful management. Longstreet's second sin was far more damning. In the Lost Causes moral universe, he had become a Republican. After the war, Longstreet had accepted the reality of Confederate defeat, taken the loyalty oath, and joined the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of Reconstruction, the party that was attempting to implement black civil rights in the South. He had accepted a federal appointment under President Grant. He had publicly supported Reconstruction in the white South of the 1870s and 1880s. This was political heresy of the first order. To support Reconstruction was to support the project of black political and civil equality. To be a Republican was to align with everything the Lost Cause defined itself against: Longstreet's military record, his genuine competence, his service to Lee throughout the war. The fact that Lee had trusted him more than any other subordinate became irrelevant. He was a traitor to the cause he had fought for, and traitors need to be punished, even posthumously. Early's campaign against Longstreet lasted for decades and was extraordinarily successful. By the late 19th century, the dominant popular narrative was that Longstreet had lost Gettysburg through his delays and his reluctance, and that Gettysburg had lost the war. The man who had been my old war horse had been transformed, in the historical memory of the South, into the man who had stabbed the Confederacy in the back. The parallel with the German stab-in-the-back myth, which we examined in the previous episode, is not coincidental. It is structural. When powerful institutions experience failure and need to locate the cause of that failure outside themselves, they reach for the traitor. The traitor performs the same function in every iteration. He explains the defeat without implicating the decision makers, because the defeat was not the result of their decisions, but of his betrayal. Early needed Longstreet for the same reason Ludendorff needed the November criminals. Defeat required a cause, and the cause could not be the commanders. Longstreet was eventually rehabilitated by academic historians in the late 20th century. Gary Gallagher's scholarship on Longstreet, along with Jeffrey Wirt's biography, documented the extent of Early's campaign and restored a more accurate assessment of Longstreet's military record. It took approximately a century. That is how long it takes to correct a targeted character assassination conducted by a well-funded institutional campaign plan. Accordingly, the Lost Cause's conquest of the South was essentially complete by 1890. What happened in the following 3 decades was its conquest of the nation, and that conquest was accomplished not primarily through academic journals or veterans organizations, but through popular culture. Specifically, through a novel, a play, and a film. Thomas Dixon Jr. was a Baptist minister, a novelist, and a man whose relationship to the truth was, to put it diplomatically, flexible. He was also one of the most effective popular propagandists the Lost Cause ever produced. His 1905 novel, The Klansman, the second in a trilogy of Lost Cause fiction, presented Reconstruction as a period of black political domination and Northern carpetbagger corruption, from which the white South was heroically rescued by the Ku Klux Klan. The novel was explicitly racist in terms that would not survive editorial review at any contemporary publisher. It portrayed black Americans as dangerous, sexually predatory, and constitutionally unfit for political participation. It portrayed the Klan as heroic defenders of white Southern civilization. In 1915, The Klansman was adapted into a film by D.W. Griffith. The film was titled The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation was the first feature-length film many Americans had ever seen. It was 3 hours long, massively expensive to produce by the standards of 1915, and technically innovative in ways that legitimately advanced the art of cinema. It was also a white supremacist propaganda film of the first order. The film depicted black Reconstruction politicians as buffoonish and corrupt. It depicted black men as threats to white women. The central dramatic crisis of the film is an attempted sexual assault by a black man against a white woman, which is depicted with the full emotional register of melodrama. And it depicted the Ku Klux Klan white men in white hoods, riding to the rescue as the heroic conclusion. The restorers of civilization. President Woodrow Wilson, a Virginian, the son of a Confederate sympathizer, and a man whose record on race is one of the most troubling of any American president, screened the film in the White House and reportedly said it was like writing history with lightning. The President of the United States screened a Klan propaganda film in the White House and called it history. The film grossed an estimated $50 to $100 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions in contemporary terms. It played to sold-out audiences across the country, including in northern cities. It was, by any measure, one of the most successful films of the silent era, and it was accompanied by real-world consequences. The Klan was refounded in November 1915, the same year as the film's release. By the early 1920s, it had between 3 and 6 million members, not just in the South, in Indiana, in Oregon, in Ohio, in states that had fought for the Union. This was the Lost Cause's greatest achievement and its most revealing one. It had made the Confederate narrative of racial hierarchy not merely a Southern regional identity but a national one. It had convinced a substantial portion of the American public that Reconstruction had been a mistake, that black political participation was dangerous, that the Klan had been a necessary corrective rather than a terrorist organization. It had done this with a film. This is what happens when myth meets mass entertainment. The myth is no longer confined to textbooks and veterans' journals. It becomes the water everyone swims in, the background assumption of the culture, the story so many people have seen and absorbed that it feels not like a version of history but like history itself. Then came Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is not, in the same explicit sense as The Birth of a Nation, a propaganda film. It is a romantic epic about loss and survival and the destruction of a way of life. It is beautifully made, emotionally effective, and centered on characters whose humanity the audience is invited to share. It is also one of the most effective pieces of Lost Cause mythology ever produced, precisely because it does not present itself as political. The world of Gone with the Wind is the antebellum South of Lost Cause mythology, a gracious, ordered, beautiful civilization undone by war. The enslaved people who populate Tara, the plantation, that is the story's emotional center, are not people being held in bondage. They are members of a household. Mammy is devoted. Prissy is comic relief. The violence, the separation of families, the systematic, brutalization that is documented in the historical record of American slavery, these are entirely absent from the world of Gone with the Wind. This is the lost cause, working at its most sophisticated, not arguing about what slavery was, but simply not depicting it, showing the plantation without the whip, showing the enslaved people without the chains, creating a visual world in which the institution that the Confederate vice president had described as the cornerstone of his government is invisible, leaving only the grace and the beauty of the civilization built on top of it. Hattie McDaniel won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for Gone with the Wind, making her the first Black American to win an Oscar. She could not attend the film's premiere in Atlanta because the theater did not admit Black patrons. The film celebrated a world built on racial hierarchy. Its premiere enforced that hierarchy, and the first Black Oscar winner received her award for playing a devoted servant whose emotional depth consisted primarily of love for her white employers. This is not a coincidence. This is the lost cause's internal logic, working perfectly. By the mid-20th century, the lost cause had achieved something remarkable. It had installed its version of Civil War history so deeply into American popular culture that the historical consensus of professional historians, which has been clear and consistent since the 1950s, could not dislodge it from the broader public mind. Polls conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries consistently found that large percentages of Americans, not just Southerners, but Americans generally believed the Civil War had been primarily about states' rights rather than slavery. In some surveys, this belief was held by a majority of respondents. The historians had the documents. They had the secession declarations. They had the Cornerstone speech. They had the Confederate Constitution. They had Jefferson Davis's letters and the records of Confederate congressional debates and the testimony of former enslaved people and the military records of the 180,000 Black men who fought for the Union. The lost cause had gone with the wind. For a long time, Gone with the Wind was winning. The correction was coming, not quickly, and not without resistance. But it was coming. Before we get to that, we need to understand one more dimension of the lost cause that makes it different from the other case studies in this season, and that makes it, in some ways, the most instructive example of all. The lost cause did not merely rewrite history. It rewrote living conditions. We have noted that the lost cause provided the ideological infrastructure for Jim Crow. Let us be more specific about the mechanism. The lost cause claimed that the antebellum South had been a well-ordered, harmonious society in which racial hierarchy was not oppression but natural arrangement. Reconstruction had disrupted this arrangement through Northern aggression and the dangerous experiment of Black political equality. The defeat of Reconstruction and the restoration of white democratic rule in the South was the restoration of proper order. This narrative did several things simultaneously. It made Black disenfranchisement feel like restoration rather than oppression, the recovery of a natural state that had been temporarily disturbed. It made segregation feel like order rather than exclusion, the proper arrangement of a society in which races were differently suited for different roles. It made white supremacist terrorism the violence of the Klan. The lynchings, the systematic intimidation of Black voters feel like defensive action rather than aggression. The protectors of civilization against the chaos of Reconstruction. None of this would have worked without the underlying narrative. The violence required justification. The lost cause provided it, and a justification backed by the cultural authority of popular novels, Hollywood films, I-approved school textbooks, and the testimony of revered Confederate veterans is not easy to challenge from outside. It is the permission structure. Ours again, different from the Holocaust's permission structure in its methods and its scale, but structurally the same. A historical narrative that transforms the perpetrator into the victim, ours the victim into the threat, and the violence into self-defense. Here is something that the history of Confederate monuments makes very clear. If you look at the data, the lost cause was not a static phenomenon. It surged in response to specific political events. It was deployed with considerable deliberateness at moments when the racial hierarchy it was designed to justify was under threat. The first surge, the wave of monuments between roughly 1,895 and 1,920, coincided with the consolidation of Jim Crow, the disenfranchisement of black voters, and the violent suppression of black political and economic life across the South. The second surge began in 1954, 1 year after the Supreme Court struck down segregated public schools in Brown v.S. Board of Education. A bronze figure of Robert E. Lee was placed in front of Robert E. Lee High School in Montgomery, Alabama. 1 year. The Southern Poverty Law Center's comprehensive survey of Confederate monuments in American public spaces, published in 2016, and updated multiple times since, documented this pattern with precision. Confederate monument construction peaked twice, once during the height of Jim Crow, and once during the Civil Rights era. In 1965, the year after the Civil Rights Act and the year of the Voting Rights Act, 9 schools were named after Confederate figures. More than any other single year. 9 schools. In a year when the federal government was legislating black voting rights. Named for men who had fought a war to keep black people enslaved. The message was not subtle. The message was the point. Here is an uncomfortable piece of trivia about the Confederate battle flag that the heritage not hate argument tends not to address. The flag that most Americans identify as the Confederate flag was not flown over Confederate government buildings during the Civil War. It was a military battle flag. The actual national flags of the Confederate States of America, there were 3 versions, looked nothing like what you see on bumper stickers and T-shirts and state capitol buildings in the 1960s photographs. The rectangular battle flag gained its current status as the dominant Confederate symbol through 2 processes. First, the Lost Cause movement's adoption of it as the primary symbol of Confederate identity. And second, its deliberate deployment as a symbol of opposition to civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s. It was raised over the South Carolina state capitol in 1962. As a statement of opposition to federal desegregation mandates, it was incorporated into the Georgia state flag in 1956, explicitly as a symbol of massive resistance to Brown v. Board of Education. Governor Marvin Griffin of Georgia, standing in front of the redesigned flag, declared that federal desegregation laws were imperiling the mores of the South. This is the second wave of the Lost Cause in its purest form, not a nostalgic commemoration of the Civil War dead, but a political statement, using Civil War symbols as weapons in a contemporary fight over civil rights. And the fight was vicious. The civil rights movement encountered the Lost Cause at every step, not as a historical debate but as a present-day political force. The people who bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church were defending the social order that the Lost Cause mythologized. The people who attacked freedom riders on buses were enforcing the racial hierarchy that the Lost Cause described as natural and proper. The politicians who wrote massive resistance legislation, who closed public schools rather than integrate them, who stood in schoolhouse doors, they were operating within a cultural framework that the Lost Cause had spent 90 years constructing. The Lost Cause did not cause these specific acts of violence, but it provided the cultural air that sustained them, the background assumption that the racial hierarchy being defended was legitimate, natural, rooted in history and tradition, and worth protecting. When Dylan Roof walked into Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, on June 17, 2015, and shot 9 black worshippers during a Bible study session. His photograph showed him holding a Confederate battle flag. He had not fought in the Civil War. He had no personal connection to Confederate history, but he had absorbed from the cultural environment in which he lived The association between that flag and a particular vision of racial order, a vision that the Lost Cause had been constructing and distributing for 150 years. The flag came down from the South Carolina State House in July 2015. It had taken the murder of 9 people in a church to get it there. This is the cost of the long persistence of the Lost Cause. Not abstractions about historical memory. 9 people. Dead in a church. Because the cultural infrastructure of white supremacy that the Lost Cause had built and maintained had been absorbing and distributing its poison for 150 years. The Lost Cause did not pull the trigger. It built the world in which the trigger was pulled. Stone Mountain. The state of Georgia purchased it in 1958. Not 1,868. 1958. 4 years after Brown v. Board of Education. The official purpose was to create a Confederate monument. The political context was the massive resistance movement against desegregation. The carving of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, 220 feet tall. The largest bas-relief sculpture in the world was completed in 1972, 107 years after the end of the Civil War, 7 years after the Voting Rights Act. It was not a memorial to the past. It was a political statement about the present. The 3 largest Confederate figures ever carved in stone. Completed 7 years after the Voting Rights Act. In the middle of the Civil Rights era's aftermath. The Lost Cause had been working since 1866. In 1972. It was still working. The academic community began seriously dismantling the Lost Cause in the mid-20th century. And by the 1980s, the historical consensus was unambiguous. The war was about slavery. This is not a contested position among professional historians. It has not been a contested position among professional historians for decades. The secession declarations, the Cornerstone speech, the Confederate Constitution, the records of Confederate congressional debates, the letters of Confederate leaders, the testimony of formerly enslaved people, the military records of the war. All of these point to the same conclusion, with a consistency that leaves no serious room for alternative interpretation. James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, published in 1988. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize. The definitive single-volume history of the Civil War, in the view of most scholars, established with comprehensive documentation that slavery was the central cause of the war. McPherson did not treat this as a controversial finding. He treated it as what the evidence showed. David Blight's Race and Reunion, published in 2001. Winner of multiple prizes. Now standard reading in American history courses documented the Lost Cause as a deliberate historical construction, tracing its architects, its institutions, its mechanisms, and its consequences. Blight showed, with meticulous sourcing, how the myth of reconciliation had been built on the sacrifice of black civil rights, how the North and South had made peace by agreeing to tell a story about the war that left out the people whose freedom had been the war's most significant outcome. These were not fringe academic publications. They were major works by major historians, published by major presses, reviewed in major venues, taught in universities across the country. The academic consensus was clear. The Lost Cause was a myth. Its claims were documented falsehoods. The war was about slavery. And yet, a 2011 poll by the Pew Research Center found that Americans were evenly divided on the question of whether the Civil War was mainly about slavery or mainly about states' rights. 48% said slavery. 40% said states' rights. The remaining 12% were unsure. In 2011, 146 years after Appomattox, with the secession documents available online, with the Cornerstone speech available online, with decades of unambiguous academic consensus available to anyone who wanted to consult it, 40% of Americans still believe the lost cause's central claim. This is the measure of the myth's success. Not that it fooled everyone, it never did. Not that it went unchallenged, it was challenged from the beginning. By Black Americans, by Union veterans, by honest historians in every generation. But that it installed itself so deeply in the cultural infrastructure of the country that it persisted long past any rational evidentiary basis, long past the academic consensus that refuted it, long past the point at which any reasonable person consulting the primary sources could conclude anything other than what the primary sources clearly say. The lost cause persisted not because it was credible, it persisted because it was everywhere. In the textbooks that had been approved for decades, in the monuments that dominated public squares, in the films that had shaped American cultural memory, in the family stories of millions of white Southerners whose identity was tied up with a version of the past that could not be revised without revising themselves. Changing a myth that is embedded in identity is not like correcting a factual error. It is not sufficient to say, here is the document that proves you wrong, because the document does not threaten the factual belief alone. It threatens the identity built around the factual belief, and identity is defended with considerably more ferocity than facts. In May 2017, New Orleans removed 4 Confederate monuments, including a statue of Robert E. Lee that had stood in Lee's circle since 1884. The process required 2 years of legal battles. Workers doing the physical removal wore body armor and worked at night, with their equipments identifying markings covered, because contractors willing to do the work in daylight had received death threats. This is the cost of confronting a myth that has been embedded in identity for 150 years. Not argument but armor, not debate but darkness and body protection. Mayor Mitch Landrieu's speech at the removal ceremonies is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the clearest public statements ever made about what the lost cause built and what it cost. He said the monuments were not history. They were propaganda. He said they had been erected not to honor soldiers but to send a message to Black citizens of New Orleans, to every person who walked past them, about who this city belonged to and who it did not. He said that the Robert E. Lee statue depicted a man who was visible to any child standing at the base of the pedestal only as the soles of his boots, a physical arrangement that encoded the hierarchy of the lost cause into the architecture of public space. The statue came down. Then came Charlottesville. On August 12, 2017, a Unite the Right rally was held in Charlottesville, Virginia, ostensibly to protest the planned removal of a Robert E. Lee statue from what was then called Lee Park. White nationalists marched with torches. They chanted. There was violence. And then a car drove into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 19 others. The Lost Cause did not organize the Unite the Right rally. The people who organized it were something considerably more explicit in their racism than the United Daughters of the Confederacy had been at their most forthcoming. But the rally was organized around a Confederate monument, used Confederate symbols, and drew on a tradition of Southern white identity politics that the Lost Cause had spent 150 years constructing and distributing. The monument that precipitated Charlottesville was, like most Confederate monuments, not from the Civil War era. The Lee statue in Charlottesville was erected in 1924 during the height of the Jim Crow era, not the Civil War's aftermath. It was not a memorial to a soldier. It was a political statement about racial hierarchy, built into the public landscape of a Virginia city during the years when the Klan was at 4 million members and the Lost Cause was at its cultural peak. In the weeks after George Floyd's murder on May 25, 2020, more Confederate monuments were removed than in any comparable period in American history. Over 160 monuments came down, some by official action, some by protesters who did not wait for official action. In Richmond, Virginia, the city that had been the Confederate capital, the Jefferson Davis statue on Monument Avenue was pulled down. The Robert E. Lee statue on Monument Avenue, which had stood since 1890 and which the city of Richmond had spent years in court trying to protect, was removed by official order. Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, had been built by the Lost Cause as an outdoor cathedral of Confederate nobility, a grand boulevard of enormous statues, a physical embodiment of the myth. In 2020, the statues came down. The pedestals stand empty now, or repurposed, or removed. The myth that built them is not empty. It has not been removed. In 2021 and 2022, a wave of state legislation restricted how American history, and specifically the history of race, could be taught in public schools. The legislation was framed around opposition to critical race theory, a term that was applied in the political debate to a range of historical content that went well beyond the academic theory it nominally described. The effect intended or otherwise was similar to what the United Confederate Veterans 1894 Textbook Committee had achieved: state-level pressure on what could be taught about the causes and consequences of racial hierarchy in American history. The specific historical content most affected included the history of slavery, the history of Reconstruction, the history of Jim Crow, and the history of systemic racism in American institutions. The Lost Cause's original textbook campaign had successfully removed slavery from Civil War curricula for decades. The critical race theory legislation of the 2020s was not the Lost Cause reborn. The people who supported it were not, in most cases, Confederate nostalgists or deliberate Lost Cause propagandists. But the structural effect restricting the historical content that could be taught about race in American public schools was recognizably similar. The mechanism outlived the myth. The habit of managing what can be taught about American racial history survived the specific ideology that had first institutionalized it. Let us be clear about what the academic consensus currently says, because it is important to state it plainly in an environment where it is sometimes treated as contested. The Civil War was fought primarily over slavery. This is the documented, unambiguous, peer-reviewed conclusion of the historical profession. It is not a politically motivated interpretation. It is what the primary sources say. The secession declarations say it. The Confederate Constitution says it. The Cornerstone speech says it. Jefferson Davis's letters say it. The Confederate congressional records say it. The Lost Cause claim that the war was about states' rights is a myth. Documented, traced to its architects, demonstrated to have been constructed deliberately for political purposes, and refuted by every piece of contemporary documentary evidence from the people who actually made the decision to secede. Confederate monuments placed on courthouse lawns and state capitals during the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era were not apolitical memorials to soldiers. They were political statements about racial hierarchy, placed in specific locations to send specific messages to Black Americans about who those public spaces belonged to and who was in charge. These are not opinions. They are documented historical findings available to anyone who wants to look. The difficulty is not the availability of the evidence. The difficulty is that the Lost Cause spent 150 years making sure that a significant portion of the American population did not want to look. Before we move to the closing argument, we need to address the question that the Lost Cause raises most acutely, in the question that distinguishes it from the other case studies in this season about the relationship between myth and identity. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was manufactured by a secret police operation for political purposes. Most of the people who believed it did not have their personal identity invested in its truth being defended. The stab in the back myth was manufactured by military commanders to avoid accountability for a military failure. The people who believed it were suffering genuinely. But their suffering was not primarily located in the myth itself. The lost cause is different. It was manufactured deliberately, systematically by people who had lost a war and who needed the loss to mean something other than what it meant. But it was absorbed, over generations, by people who were not Confederate veterans, who had never owned enslaved people, who had no direct connection to the Civil War, and who nonetheless found, in the lost cause mythology, something that spoke to their identity as white Southerners, as Americans, as inheritors of a history that the myth described as noble and the historical record described as not. When you tell someone that the thing they were taught to be proud of was built on a lie, you are not merely correcting a historical error. You are telling them that a part of how they understand themselves is based on something false. That is a different kind of challenge. It is the challenge that the civil rights movement confronted, that the monument removal debates confronted, that every serious attempt to reckon with American racial history confronts, and it is, ultimately, the challenge that history itself poses. The past is not what we were told it was, and becoming the people who can face what it actually was requires a willingness to revise, not just our knowledge, but our sense of ourselves. Not everyone is willing to do that. Not simultaneously. Not without significant emotional cost. But some people are, and the historical record of the past few decades suggests cautiously, without triumphalism, that the number willing to make that revision is growing. The pedestals are empty in Richmond. The flag came down in South Carolina. The history is not over. Let us build the anatomy of manufactured nobility with care. Because it is the dimension of the big lie that the first 2 episodes of this season did not fully address, and that the lost cause exemplifies more completely than any other case study in this series. The protocols of the elders of Zion manufactured an enemy. It needed its audience to believe that a specific group of people was conspiring against them. The emotional core of the myth was fear and hatred directed outward. The stab-in-the-back myth manufactured a defeat. It needed its audience to believe that a victory had been stolen from them by internal traitors. The emotional core was betrayal and resentment directed at specific scapegoats. The lost cause manufactured something different from both of these. It manufactured nobility. The lost cause did not primarily ask its audience to hate. It asked its audience to admire, to feel pride, to identify with a tradition of courage and honor and sacrifice that it claimed had been unfairly maligned by the victors who got to write the history. This is a fundamentally different psychological operation than the manufactured enemy or the manufactured defeat. It is not primarily a negative emotion being weaponized. It is a positive one, the deep human need for ancestors worth being descended from, for a history worth claiming, for a past that gives the present dignity. The lost cause offered white Southerners, and eventually many white Americans more broadly, exactly this: a past worth being proud of, an ancestry of honor and courage, a civilization of grace that had been destroyed by force, not by the justice of its own contradictions. This is why the lost cause was so much harder to dislodge than the myths that relied on fear and hatred. Fear and hatred can be challenged by demonstrating that the threat they identified was not real. But pride, the pride of lineage, the pride of ancestry, the pride of belonging to a tradition, is not dissolved by evidence. It is defended by it. Every attack on the lost cause was perceived as an attack on the people who had been raised to take pride in what the lost cause described. The manufactured nobility works through intergenerational identity. The grandfather fought. The father grew up honoring the grandfather's sacrifice. The grandchild grew up in a world in which honoring the sacrifice was simply what people in their community did, a social practice so embedded in the fabric of daily life that questioning it felt not like intellectual inquiry but like personal betrayal. By the time the academic consensus on the Civil War was clearly established by the 1960s and 1970s, when the historical profession had thoroughly documented the lost cause as myth, the myth had been transmitting itself for 3 or 4 generations. It was not a belief that people held after examining evidence. It was a belief that people held because it was part of who they were. This is the lost cause's deepest success and its deepest crime. It did not just falsify history. It built an identity on the falsification. It made the lie personal. And when a lie becomes personal when believing it is part of who you are, and disbelieving it requires revising who you are, the evidence against it is no longer simply information. It is a threat. The psychologist Dan Kahan at Yale Law School has documented, across multiple studies, what he calls identity protective cognition, the tendency to evaluate evidence in ways that protect existing group identities rather than in ways that maximize accuracy. The more strongly someone's identity is tied to a particular belief, the more resistant they are to evidence that challenges it, and the more adept they become at finding reasons to dismiss that evidence. This is not stupidity. It is not ignorance. It is how human beings work. Across cultures and education levels and political affiliations, we are all identity-protective cognitizers. The difference between us lies in which identities we protect and how much those protections cost. The lost cause built its myth into identity so thoroughly that challenging the myth required challenging the identity. This is why the monument debates were and remain so emotionally charged. The monuments were not simply being evaluated as accurate or inaccurate historical representations. They were being evaluated as affirmations or denials of the identity of the people who had grown up in their shadow. Taking down a Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond was, to many people who had been raised in the lost cause tradition, not an act of historical correction. It was an act of desecration of their ancestors, of themselves. The question this episode has been building toward, the question that manufactured nobility forces us to grapple with in a way that the other big lies in this season do not, is, what do you do with an identity built on a falsification? Not how do you prove the falsification that is the easy part. The evidence is there. The secession declarations exist. The Cornerstone speech exists. The hard part is, how do you invite people to revise an identity without demanding that they condemn themselves, their families, their communities, and everything they were raised to be proud of? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the practical challenge that every serious attempt at historical reckoning in America, in Germany, in South Africa, in every country that has had to confront a painful past that powerful interests mythologized has had to address. Germany provides the most studied example of a society that undertook the project of revising an identity built on a catastrophic falsification, and that did so imperfectly and over decades, with significant institutional commitment and genuine moral seriousness. The German process, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally coming to terms with the past, was not quick, was not painless, and was not universally embraced. It began in earnest in the 1960s, with a generation of young Germans who had not fought in the war, and who were less invested in their parents' self-protective narratives. It was accelerated by the Nuremberg trials, by the work of independent historians, by the Auschwitz trials of the 1960s, and by sustained political pressure from civil society. It produced mandatory Holocaust education in German schools, legal prohibitions on Holocaust denial, the Stolperstein, the small brass plaques set into sidewalks across Germany commemorating individual Jewish victims, the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, the systematic documentation of perpetrators, the formal acknowledgments by German heads of state. None of this returned the dead. None of it fully addressed what had been done. But it represented a genuine attempt by a society to face what it had built on falsification, to look at the myth and the reality simultaneously and choose the reality Germany did not achieve this by demanding that individual Germans condemn their grandparents as monsters. It achieved it by asking Germans to distinguish between the humanity of individuals caught up in historical circumstances and the moral evaluation of the systems and ideologies those individuals served. Your grandfather was a person. He was also someone who participated, at whatever level, in a system that was wrong. Both of these things are true, and being the grandchild of someone who participated in a wrong does not make you guilty of that wrong, but it does give you a particular responsibility to understand it. This is the framework that the American reckoning with the lost cause has been, unevenly and incompletely, reaching toward the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama opened in 2018 as the closest American equivalent to Germany's systematic memorialization of victims, created by Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative. It documents more than 4,000 racial terror lynchings in the United States between 1,877 and 1,950, the period when the lost cause was at its cultural peak, when the myth of Confederate nobility was being built into textbooks and monuments in popular culture. The memorial hangs over 800 steel monuments, one for each American county where racial terror lynchings occurred. Each monument bears the names of those who were killed. It exists 6 blocks from the Alabama State Capitol building, where Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as Confederate president. 6 blocks from where George Wallace stood in 1963 and said, "Segregation now. Segregation tomorrow. Segregation forever." 6 blocks. History is not always distant. The American reckoning with the lost cause is ongoing and unfinished. It is progressing in some places and retreating in others. It is contested at every level in school boards and state legislatures and museum curators' offices and city councils, deciding what to do with empty pedestals. This is not a sign of failure. The German reckoning took decades and was never without opposition. The South African reckoning with apartheid is still in progress 50 years after apartheid ended. Historical reckonings are not events. They are processes. They do not conclude. They continue. What the Lost Cause teaches us, the specific lesson that manufactured nobility adds to the season's argument, is that the most durable myths are not the ones that make you afraid. They are the ones that make you proud. Fear can be addressed with safety. Hatred can be addressed with exposure of the lie. But pride, the pride of ancestry, of tradition, of belonging to a story that tells you that you and your people are worth being, that pride requires something more subtle and more difficult than debunking. It requires offering an alternative pride, a way of belonging to a history that does not depend on denying what that history contained. The alternative, in the American case, is not the erasure of Southern identity or the condemnation of everyone whose ancestors fought for the Confederacy. It is the recognition that a region's identity can be built on its full history, including the parts that are painful and wrong, and that a pride built on honest reckoning is more durable and more legitimate than a pride built on myth. You can be from the South without being from the lost cause. You can honor your ancestors without honoring what they fought for. You can understand why this Civil War happened, what it was about, and what it cost, and still find, in that honest account, things worth being from. But that requires giving up the myth. And myths that have been built into identity over 150 years are not given up easily. They are given up slowly, partially, with enormous resistance, over generations of sustained effort by people who keep doing the work of making the evidence available and the alternative identity imaginable. The work is not done. Alexander Stephens stood before a crowd in Savannah, Georgia, in March 1861, and said slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederacy. He said it was the immediate cause of secession. He said it clearly, proudly, without hedging. 20 years later, and he denied he had said it, claimed he had been misquoted, and spent the remainder of his life promoting the lost cause version of the war. The transcript of the speech was published in multiple newspapers at the time. It has been in the historical record ever since. It is available to anyone who wishes to read it. The lost cause could not erase the Cornerstone speech. It could only hope that enough people would never bother to look it up. For 100 years, enough people did not bother. The speech is still there. So is the work of making sure people read it.